So the talk today is why John Wayne works social engineering in the wild, wild west, which was a really fun title to come up with. I hope the talk follows through. So who am I? I work for Alias Cybersecurity. I'm a communications director, technical writer. I am not John Wayne, but most of my background was actually in education. So I was in education for about 20 years and then made the transition to cybersecurity. And so I'm going to come at this a little bit maybe differently than somebody who's been in the field. I'm going to come at it sort of as an academic, but also as someone who's had the fun of going on a couple of, well, legal bank heists. I guess that would be the term. My daughter thinks it's fun to think that I break into banks, and I say, well, I do have a letter of consent, so it's not exactly breaking in. So something that I do, so this has been a talk I've given a couple of times. I have 15 minutes, so any Spaceball fans in here? Spaceballs? This is the short version. So if you know the movie, if you don't know the movie, go watch it. One of the things that I would do when I was teaching about this with students is I would have one of the students, a male student, come up, and we would stand about 6 inches away from each other. And I would do everything I could in presentation not to be aggressive. I would stand very calmly. I would actually be smiling. And then I would ask that student what they were feeling, and then the rest of the students in class, like, what they were feeling. And everybody was always tense. And the other student would be very polite at first and say, what do you want to do? I'm 6 inches away from you. What do you want to do? And they'd say, I want to back up. I said, no, no, no. What do you really want to do? And they'd say, well, I want to push you away. I'd say, okay. Why? I'm not being threatening at all. I'm presenting zero threat. And then I would turn to the other students, and especially the male students, the audience would be really tense, like they'd be leaning forward. What were they expecting? They're expecting a fight. Even though I was not being aggressive, even though there was no threat to anyone, the fact that we were so close together communicated something to them that there was a potential there for violence. And so we see that, well, there you have fighters and wrestlers, but also politicians, right? They're obviously engaged in a very heated debate, and then strangely enough, smiling at each other. That was just a weird contrast for me. And what was interesting to me is when I went and I just said, hey, Bing, give me images of two people facing each other, especially two men facing each other. You have to scroll down a long ways before you find a picture that is not aggressive. Almost all of the hits first are a fight, aggression. The tags will be like two brothers fighting. So it's interesting that even that tells us something about how our culture perceives two people, again, not necessarily aggressive, but just in proximity, we read aggression. So again, coming at this a little bit sideways, I want to talk about two different engagements, one of which was one of my coworkers, another one of which I was actually involved in. And sort of talk about here's what happened in each of these, and then use those as springboards to talk about what the talk's actually about. So in the first one, I had a coworker, and actually the flag for the engagement was to get thrown out of the bank. The employer had actually said, I want you to get thrown out of the lobby, right? Actually, before he got thrown out, he would have presented the letter and not had that physical altercation, but the goal was to have security actually want to remove him from the building. So what's interesting is it didn't work. He couldn't get the flag. What he did is he walked in and he just started plugging into network ports. Some of you are getting horrified, as you should. So he does this, and eventually somebody comes over and says, you've got to stop that. And he looked at him and said, you're right, I should probably stop that, and then just kept doing it. They go, and eventually the IT director comes like, dude, you've got to stop doing that. He's like, I know, this is terrible. If I were you, I would want me to stop doing this too, and just kept going. Finally, a security guard comes over, and the security guard's like, sir, you must stop this. He says, I agree, this is probably really offensive and dangerous, and just keeps doing it. He's trying to get thrown out, and eventually he just had to walk out. They would not throw him out. Okay, so think about that. This is somebody who's doing something obviously threatening. They won't throw him out. This is one that actually happened to me. So this was a company. We gotten hired again to try to get in. I was this close to getting into the building, which if you've done a physical, you're like, dang it, I was almost in. If I'd waited just 5 seconds, I would have made it in. But anyway, a coworker the night before had been successful. And what happened is eventually their director of IT came and he was like, could walk me out. I spent maybe 90 seconds between the time he first encountered me and I left the property. And as we're walking, he repeated that he could have called the cops probably 3 times, and he used the phrase armed guard at least 5. Like, hey, we have armed guards. And that was obviously a little bit emphasized over and over and over again. And then he let me leave. But that was sort of the entirety of our conversation for 90 seconds was him sort of telling me I could have called the cops. We have armed guards. And then he let me walk away. And emphasis on, in his mind, he was letting me walk away. So 2 really weird different experiences. One where he can't get thrown out, the other which this guy is really emphasizing to me that things could have gone badly. So, what's going on? Okay, this is the geeky, nerdy, academic part. This is what's called a culture of honor. If you're interested in this, I can talk about some books. There's really interesting podcasts out there about it. But basically, a culture of honor happens when you have a situation where there's scarce resources, there's not a lot of law, and basically the only way to defend your scarce resources is to be known as somebody who will defend your scarce resources, potentially violently. It's really based upon what you're going to do and your reputation. So in America, what's really interesting is this actually comes from the Scots, who, if you think about Braveheart or something like that, you have a place where there's not a lot of resources, there's not strong law, or if it is, it's the English and nobody likes that. And so how you prove that you are a man, how you prove that you are not someone to be messed with is there's always that potential. And what happens then is you have this migration that happens into the South and into the West, which is what gives us the Wild West, where again, scarce resources, little law enforcement, the way that you prove that you are not to be messed with is violence or potential violence. And if you think about it, the way that you are known as somebody who can defend yourself is entirely based on your reputation. How are you perceived and what do people know about you? That's also why you have things in the South like duels. How do you prove your honor and your reputation? You are willing to shoot someone. Or a lot of duels were actually you're not supposed to shoot someone. It was just the potential that you could shoot someone. And you actually shot in the air and there's all that. But basically it was I'm going to prove myself to you by doing this. Okay, so this comes down to a cultural code. When I was getting ready for this talk, I actually found this. I did not know this book existed. I'm incredibly interested. The official John Wayne Handybook for Men. Was anybody in here like raised on Westerns? My dad loved Westerns. Anyone? No? Oh man. Okay. So the Wild West, but also, here's what's really interesting about the culture of honor. It actually influences what we might consider more polite society. So it's not all just the Wild, Wild West. It actually has another manifestation that's more polite society. So in a culture of honor, everything is based on honor and shame. Right? If you think about those 2 things are opposite. If it's not honorable, it's shameful. If it's not shameful, it's honorable. And the way that works out is that it is your reputation that's everything. How are you known? What sort of man, what sort of woman, how are you known? And what are those characteristics that make you a good or a bad person? Again, what's always underneath the surface is the potential for aggression. So violence is always possible. Just like when I was standing close to a student and expressing no threat to that student, there was potential, and everyone else in the classroom, there was potential. I did that lots of years. What was interesting is the one time I had that example not work, which is really annoying sometimes, was a student who wasn't from Oklahoma or Texas or the South. He was actually from the Northeast. He felt no threat and no aggression. He was totally cool with me being 6 inches away from him and didn't feel like he wanted me out of his personal space, but he didn't feel the impetus to push me or to hit me. He was just like, I don't like this, but that's okay. What's interesting is therefore there are all sorts of cultural dynamics that are about avoiding violence. You want to get in front of it and not have it happen, because even though it's always potential, you actually don't want it. Because once it happens, once there's a one-up and you pass a certain point, right, thinking about you cross the line, it is going to happen and there is no way to stop it. So one of the ways this works out, I'm from Oklahoma. People in Oklahoma are very polite, which is great. I love that quality. And politeness is actually a way to avoid aggression. If I am polite to you, it is very hard for you to get mad at me. It's a way to say, okay, we're all okay. We're going to kind of keep this calm. In this picture here, so raising the hat, tipping the hat, there are a lot of expressions of this, a lot of really interesting expressions with this. I'm wondering if anybody can complete the phrase. Never start a fight, but always finish one. Or always pick on someone your own size. Why? Because it's your reputation. And if you are someone who starts a fight with someone smaller, that's not cool. That's not proving your reputation. That's proving you beat up on people who are smaller than you, no matter what they're doing. Never start a fight. Initiating aggression, don't do that. But once it's there, once you've crossed that line, you better take it, because you have to prove your reputation. I'm somebody who finishes a fight. The whole politeness is really interesting. I have an aunt who moved from Delaware and Massachusetts. And when she got here, this is so funny. She came to us about a week and a half, and she was talking about being in Walmart, and she said, "These people keep asking me how I am. What business is it of theirs?" Well, Jane, that's polite. And another time she said, "I was reaching for somebody, and like something, this guy came up and he offered to get it for me." And she was very offended. We're like, that's being polite. But to her, she just didn't have that experience. Those are cultural expressions of, oh, I ask how you are, right? We all know I'm probably not getting the narrative of your life, but it's a way to be polite. Or alternatively, I'm going to help you because that's what it means to have this certain reputation. It's a politeness that then works itself out. But to her, that was strange and weird. Now she's come to love it, but at first it was just totally foreign to her. So when people love the politeness of Oklahoma or other parts of the US where that's true, that's great. I'm all for it. I love it. And at the same time, recognize that there's this cultural phenomenon that's kind of underneath the surface. One of the famous expressions, I can't even remember where it comes from, is when you call me that, smile, right? It's okay to sort of almost cross the line as long as you're being polite. I think about if you're in the South, bless your heart is a really nice phrase. That actually means something very different depending upon how you say it. I come from a family where that phrase has been used. I'm like, you actually don't mean bless their heart at all. You mean something, you actually mean the opposite. Okay, so let's go back to those two exploits and talk about what was happening. So if you think about in the first, the detail I left out is that my coworker is a lot smaller than I am. He himself would say kind of diminutive, he's not threatening, nothing like that. And what he was able to do is actually on multiple occasions, not knowing anything about this, use it to his advantage. So when he goes into this bank, if you think about the code, what if somebody's going around plugging into a network port, you would expect them to be kind of aggressive about it, like, I deserve to be here. This is what I'm doing. Get out of my face. He stays totally calm. He is being as polite as he can be. He's actually, if you think about it, this is what's so weird. I mean, I would be weirded out about this. He's actually acknowledging the other person's perspective, like, you're right, this is totally offensive, and then just keeps doing it, right? Imagine that you're one of the people there. Imagine you're a security guard, right? Your job is to keep the bank safe. That is what you are supposed to do. That means that potentially you do have to physically remove somebody from the bank. That is part of your job. But the code that you would expect is you're going to do that when the other person is being belligerent or threatening or doing something that is creating a physical harm. Here you have somebody who is smaller than you. Again, always pick on somebody your own size, who is not being threatening. Don't start a fight, always finish one. And who is doing something legitimately that he shouldn't be doing, but it's not presenting a physical harm to the bank. So you can imagine the security guard kind of standing there going, what do I do? Because remember, it's about reputation. This is the lobby of the bank. Everyone is going to see him if he gets aggressive. And his reputation in his mind is going to go down. Because, dude, he wasn't doing anything big and you threw him out of the bank. You physically got aggressive with him. Right? So in that sense, it's kind of understandable, although he should have thrown the guy out, that he didn't. Now, in the other case, several things were going on here, right? One, I had almost made it in. So that, right, if you're doing a physical, that is sort of physically threatening. A coworker had actually made it in the night before, actually the same coworker, funnily enough, had made it in the night before. He had gotten recognized and caught after he'd been watering the facility for 10, 15 minutes. So as this guy comes to approach me, remember this is about reputation. I've got, in a sense, we had gotten into his space, his house, right? This is his job, this is what he's supposed to do, this is his location. We'd made it in. We'd, in that sense, transgressed a boundary. His reputation was on the line, right? Even though he knew that we were going to be there, his reputation was on the line. So what does he do with me? Well, he's not going to get physically aggressive. That wouldn't be okay. He is going to escort me off. That's great. That's appropriate. But he's going to remind me of what he could have done. I could have called the cops, in which case they would have come and taken care of you. Oh yeah, and by the way, we have armed guards. Hey dude, if you made it inside, what could have happened? You could have gotten shot. He's not going to get aggressive, but what he's going to do to reestablish his reputation with me is remind me that he could have. There is the potential for aggression. In fact, he was so bad that when my coworkers and I got back together and we were talking about this, and then when we debriefed, he actually brought it up a few more times, that at one point we actually said, should we tell the employer about this? Like, this was actually kind of making us all uncomfortable. Like, this guy talked about guns a lot. Not about guns, but like the potential for using guns to stop people from entering the facility. Like that, it was a little bit weird. But what he was doing is he was telling all three of us, look, warning, this could have gone really bad for you. And so there's this really interesting, weird contrast. Really polite, no violence, potential for sort of your reputation getting harmed, aggression. One of the things to think about is there is this sense of where sort of migration happened, but also there tends to be a little bit of a divide between cities and rural areas. Rural areas tend to be far more conservative, not politically necessarily, but in terms of culture, right? Again, think if you grew up in a rural area, I did. Historically, those are places where there wasn't a lot of law. Your land was what you had. Culture's weird. It kind of tends to conserve itself, even though it doesn't make any sense anymore. So that's one of the divides. Also, again, just location in parts of the state. It tends to work itself out politically. So very politically charged things sometimes go towards a culture of honor. Anybody in here a fan of the film This Is Spinal Tap? Couple. Okay, again, go watch the movie. It's fun. The scene where he says this goes to 11 on his amp, that's kind of what you can think about sometimes. So somebody that I think about, if you want to think about somebody who typifies like the most extreme version of this, whatever you think about him, is Donald Trump, right? He is all about his reputation. Everything is potential. And if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, you just said that, that's probably because I'm potentially going after somebody you've tied your reputation to. This is not a political commentary. Just realize that's what happens. We do this with political figures. Their reputation becomes our reputation. And then what happens? The potential, at least what seems to be the potential for violence. This also has an outworking with, so that's mainly the men, with women. Think about polite society. Women are demurring. They are very polite. They are non-threatening. Why? Because if they are, there's the potential for violence. Not a totalizing statement, not endorsing that. Just realize that that's part of what happens in those societies. Okay. Now, it'd be really easy to hear all this and think that all sounds bad. Okay, they're not great expressions, they're also good expressions. Cultures of honor actually predict for a number of things too. One bad, then one that's really good. If you want to look at school shootings, they tend to happen more in culture of honor states. Why? Because if my reputation is threatened, how do I defend it? I get violent. That's obviously a really bad expression. However, culture of honor states also predict for Medal of Honor winners. Why? Because I identify with my group and I'm going to do what I need to do to defend my group, right? So that's not a bad, that's actually a really good expression. So it's a coin, right? There's two sides to it. And I want to talk about what this looks like so that's great, here's all this academic stuff, blah, blah, blah. How does this actually help you if you're thinking about doing a physical penetration test? And then if you're a defender, if you're somebody who runs a company, how can you help your employees if you know that this is influencing them? So for the social engineer, looking, one, where do you live? You can know some things culturally about that, but also do some research about the company. What do they value? What do they honor? What is considered shameful? Look at social media posts. What sort of things do employees do, especially the leadership? Because culture ultimately comes from the leaders. Look for things like, do they have back the blue stickers? This is not a political commentary. Just realize that often that means that there's a reputation which identifies with a certain expression, and that tends to be more of a culture of honor. Not entirely. If you have that sticker, it's not a commentary. Just realize that's true. You can tell certain things about this sort of organization. Again, do social media. Drive by the place. What do you notice? Notice how they have security set up. A lot of that will tell you a lot of what's going on with that organization. For the defender, okay, so if you have an organization and you know that this influences your staff, so if you are in a location where you know that this is true, how do you actually help your staff? So one of the things to do is, it's not bad to be polite, but you need to teach them not to apologize. Never apologize for not letting someone into your space. You can stay polite. I actually had this modeled one time when I was on another exploit trying to get into a place, and the receptionist wouldn't let me in, and actually I found out later, felt really bad about that. She said, look, you can't go in, but can I get you a water while I go find someone who can verify your story? That was beautiful. That was exactly right. Not apologetic, still very polite. Hey, let me get you a water. Are you comfortable? Right? Very polite, maintaining that politeness, which was good, not apologizing. Because if you apologize for not letting me in, what are you telling me you think should happen? I should be allowed in. The second you apologize, it creates an opening for me as a social engineer, because you are saying that culturally you understand there is a code and I should be allowed in. And a good social engineer is going to exploit that. I now know something about you, and I know something about what you actually want to do. You want to let me in. You don't feel like you can. Now I can find all sorts of ways to play on that feeling to get you to let me in. Right? So teaching them, don't apologize. Right? This is not an apology. You can still be polite, but you don't apologize. I would suggest no-fault training. And what I mean by that is, it really bothers me when I do phishing engagements for our company too. It really bothers me when there's a company that, like, you click on a link, you do a phish, you're fired. You just incentivized your people not telling the truth. If I know you're going to fire me when I click on a phishing link, and I click on it, or I even think I clicked on a phishing link, I am probably not going to tell you, because I don't want to get fired, and I'm really hoping either it wasn't a phishing link or you're just not going to notice, or whatever, right? So there's that, but also realize, what do you honor as an organization? Do you honor the people who bring it to your attention that it's a potentially, even if it's the annoying, the person like refers all their emails to you, okay, that's training, but do you honor that and say, I'm really glad that you brought this to my attention? If somebody does something, you're doing a physical and somebody lets somebody in the building, right? Depending upon the severity of what that means, there are gradations of the response. Do you have that where you actually would honor that person, not by saying, I'm really glad you did that, but hey, this is a chance to train them. This is a chance to help them understand what happened. I would rather the employee tell me than not tell me. I would rather they be like, yeah, I let him in. On one of the engagements, we had a case where my coworker was able to get in because a contractor had left a door propped open. That contractor didn't get fired for propping the door open. That contractor got fired for lying about it because they had it on video. Right? That organization, from what I know of them, if he had just said, you're right, I did that, would have taken that as an opportunity to say, okay, now here's training. Here's the way that we go through this. Having said that, if you're in a culture of honor, I have no research on this. This is just me sort of thinking through this. I would be hesitant to have a system where when somebody, say, fails a phishing test, they automatically get training. I know that there's value in that. I know that there's a lot of good in that. But thinking about it for myself, because I did grow up in a culture of honor, to me, even though no one else knows about it, that feels shameful if it's automatic. Why? Because you're not actually dealing with me as a person. That feels like an affront to my reputation. Again, I don't know. I'm just saying, as I thought about this personally, I could see that as potentially being an issue. How do you know your people? Again, a lot of this is know your organization, know your people. How do you choose to show honor and respect to your people, and how does that live itself out? So there's no magic bullet here, but these are ways I think that are helpful to sort of think about in categories, both if you're the one doing the engagement or alternatively the one who is acting to defend your organization. Just knowing where you live, knowing who you are, knowing your people. Right? Maybe you don't live in a culture of honor state, but you know that those 3 people came from that and they do have that in their background. That should affect the way that you interact with them, because they're probably not going to get violent with you, but always underneath is, if I go after the reputation, if I make their reputation feel threatened, they're going to react in a way different than maybe somebody who wasn't. So know your people, know what's going on. So this is interesting to me. This is something that I've talked with our engineers about. The guy who actually made it in, who was the polite one, was like, he'd sort of instinctively done this, but it was helpful for him to go, oh, now I know why this works, and it helped him become better at it. Like, oh, now I can sort of read the person. A lot of social engineering is reading the person well. But part of that is knowing what's going on behind their consciousness. This is not conscious. But what's going on behind that might influence the way that they're going to react to me. And if you know that, it makes you a more effective social engineer, which is ultimately the goal.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You mentioned there's some books or podcasts you recommend. What would you?
Okay, I'm going to give a shameless plug for my brother-in-law, who's a social scientist. He's got a book called Honor Bound. That's a really good, it will give you both, so he's coming from a social scientist perspective. He does empirical research, but it's really good in terms of presenting a narrative and layman's term. So you'll get a good sense of how cultures of honor work. And he's also a researcher, so he'll have tons of resources in the back. If you want a very brief introduction, in Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, I think it is, he's got a chapter on culture of honor.